Oftentimes, when people of the world think about British industry and the British economy, these are the images that come to mind. Abandoned warehouses, abandoned factory floors that, if they're lucky, have at least been properly cleaned out, but that's about it. Not a single person working, and the unemployment rate at record highs. At least that's the sort of thing they remember from the 1960s and 70s all the way through the 90s. And so the very idea that the British could really get a space industry going when they can't even get the fundamentals of industrial production going seems far-fetched as best. But yet, that is not what the reality is. Not even close. And then, of course, there's images like this, social unrest in Brixton, something that's happened a number of times over the years during times of racial strife in London, although it is nowhere near what it used to be back in the 70s and 80s, this particular riot having taken place in 1981. As a matter of fact, there was a great deal of social unrest that took place in 1977, albeit not in Brixton, as I'm going to say in the opening remarks. That's actually a family myth. It took place elsewhere, but nevertheless, there was a great deal of social unrest going on during this time period, whereas the tourists saw nothing but well-behaved people and everything very tranquil and lovely, whereas in the background, there was a great deal of chaos, a great deal of unemployment, and a great deal of discontent. And although things are far from perfect now, as far as spaceflight is concerned, and indeed as far as the British economy is concerned, things are taking a decided turn for the better. And to this end, the British government has announced that they intend to open not one, not two, but 3 spaceports across the UK, in Cornwall and in Wales and in Scotland, utilizing a company called Orbex, but also being open to a variety of other companies, including the very well-known Virgin Orbit. And Lockheed Martin is going to be one of the partners in this endeavor. Now, the UK would simply not be opening 3 spaceports and the huge amount of money involved in this if they were not going into this whole industry with both feet. As a matter of fact, their stated intention is to grab 10% of the spaceflight economy of the entire planet. How the hell do they intend to accomplish all of this? Well, we're gonna find out in just a few minutes. Good morning, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, a very unusual topic today, but one that I enjoy covering, that is to say, unusual topics, and that is to say, spaceflight, or rather private spaceflight in the United Kingdom, with a little bit of nationalism thrown in there just for good measure. If you had told me 20 years ago that the UK would be taking the lead in private spaceflight in Europe, I would have laughed for at least 2 or 3 solid minutes. there would have been no chance whatsoever, and certainly not 40 years ago. Most of us here in the States, and indeed in North America and in much of the world, have looked upon the financial and economic state of Great Britain much the same as it was during the 1970s, when their automotive industry was in a tailspin. There was an enormous amount of unemployment, labor strikes all over the place. The first time that I visited Great Britain in 1977, there was in fact massive riots going on in Brixton, which I had no idea about. My parents managed to shield me from this particular event, but nevertheless, they were going on. There were some grim things happening in Britain at the time. Their products were no longer in demand, and it did indeed seem that the sun was finally setting on the British Empire. However, this has proven to not be the case. Not at all. Great Britain at this stage varies anywhere from the fifth to the sixth largest economy on the planet. They are substantially larger than Russia, and if they are so much larger than Russia, even though their population is so much smaller, why don't they have a space program that comes anywhere near matching what they have? It really hasn't made any sense to me for quite some time. Well, apparently, it hasn't made a whole lot of sense to the British people either. And the private space industry, together with public initiatives, are working to change this. Now, all of us have heard about the efforts being made as far as smallsats are concerned. Virgin Orbit, I don't care what anybody says. Virgin Orbit is based out of the United States purely for political reasons, because they can't get military contracts if they're not. And I'll give you a very good reason as to why that's the case. The British are building 3 spaceports in the UK as we speak. One in Cornwall, which I've talked about a number of times, Spaceport Cornwall, another one in Wales, and another one in Scotland. All 3 of which have runways capable of accommodating Virgin Orbit 747s. Why would they have 3 of these unless Virgin Orbit was moving a substantial amount of their operations to Great Britain? Officially, they may retain their headquarters in the United States, but in actuality, Virgin Orbit, just like Virgin Airlines and Virgin Rail, is going to be a British company. But they're not the only ones. There are quite a number of other British companies, some of which I have talked about, some of which I have not, one of which I've mentioned not just briefly, I did an interview with them, Spacebit, who is putting the first UK mission on the moon here very shortly. A lot of things happening, and a lot of it I haven't mentioned, including a method to not just put up small sats, but to put up very substantial payloads into low Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, and indeed even to the moon, using an innovative method that doesn't involve a mega rocket the way the Starship is, but instead involves a very innovative and unique space plane. Yes, we've talked about space planes forever. They've always gotten us start and stop, and they've never really come to fruition. But it appears that this concept is finally coming to fruition, and it is the nation of Great Britain that's bringing this whole idea to a reality. Interested? Well, listen further, my friends, because you're going to get a lot of information that you may not have heard of before on The Angry Astronaut right now. Okay, I lied. There are, in fact, 7 of these sites either being proposed or constructed at the moment, the first of which is a very small facility located in the Hebrides that's being used for small sounding rockets and very small satellites, and it's being run by an organization called Kinetic in conjunction with an organization called Highlands and Islands Enterprise and the Commercial Space Technologies Consultancy. The next is the Shetland Space Center, also vertical launch, designed for cargoes anywhere from 30 to 600 kilograms, so once again, fairly small cargoes, and up to 3 launch pads. Space Hub Sutherland is a very small launching facility being leased actually from the Melness Crofters estate, and it will have an upper limit of 12 flights per year, probably exclusively by the Orbex company, which I'll discuss later. A more ambitious horizontal spaceport is being planned at the Glasgow Prestwick Airport, and this has £80 million worth of funding from both the UK government and the Scottish government. And this is going to handle the air launch of satellites, microgravity flights, hypersonic flights, and even space tourism. Does that sound like Virgin Galactic to anybody? Very exciting stuff happening in Scotland. And right next door is the Campbelltown Airport, an absolutely enormous airfield over 3 kilometers long that used to be a backup emergency landing site for the space shuttle. Obviously, a perfect runway for Virgin Orbit, and also for something else that we'll get to in a moment. And don't forget about the Welsh. At a former RAF airfield, the Snowdonia Aerospace Organization has leased this particular airfield for horizontal satellite launches. Once again, a Virgin Orbit type of specialty, but also other types of aircraft are looking to take this sort of thing on, hint, hint, along with developing space research and the launching of satellites and drones, the training of astronauts, aeromedicine, satellite development, a visitor center, planetarium, and even a hotel. And then, of course, there's my personal favorite, Spaceport Cornwall. The location of this spaceport could not be more perfect. Right by the ocean, which is a perfect place to launch rockets so that if things go awry, it falls safely into the sea, but there's a lot more on top of that. It has a very long airfield, therefore being perfectly appropriate for Virgin Orbit facilities. As you can see, the shelters are from the Cold War, so they're hardened and very resistant to any sort of explosive accidents, and a lot of fire suppression on site as well. This is a Cold War facility, previously used for conflict, for the worst possible scenarios, and now being used for man's exploration and expansion into the solar system, not just low Earth orbit, but far beyond. And for those of you familiar with Goonhilly, it's one of the most advanced deep space and satellite tracking systems on the planet. It's going to provide 2,000 jobs to the area by 2028 and £320 million to the economy. And the spaceflight market, I think this is very conservative, $25 billion. I think that a lot more is going to be realized out of this. I think the $25 billion is just how much the UK is going to realize. And a lot of this is coming from, guess who? Virgin Orbit. And why do I feel so optimistic about these guys? I mean, they've only had one successful launch. Well, it is simply because of the logistical efficiency of their operations. They can launch from virtually anywhere on the planet. If you want a polar launch or a solar synchronous launch, you simply fly the 747, also known as Cosmic Girl, up to that area. If you want to launch from the equator, you fly the 747 there. very few other launch platforms can do things this way. In addition, since Virgin Orbit uses a 747 essentially as a reusable first stage, it's capable of launching its payload from an altitude of 10,000 meters before it burns a single gram of fuel. Consequently, it's able to get 500 kilograms up to low Earth orbit, as opposed to Rocket Lab that can only get 300 kilograms. And then Virgin Orbit can get that same 300 kilograms up to sun synchronous orbit. In other words, Virgin Orbit can get the same payload to a much more difficult sun synchronous orbit as Rocket Lab can to low Earth orbit. This is a significant advantage, and undoubtedly why Peter Beck has decided to go ahead with the Neutron. As a matter of fact, he made that decision before Virgin Orbit even had their first successful test launch. Very intelligent on his part, and it's going to be quite the race to see how quickly Rocket Lab can develop Neutron before Virgin Orbit can potentially start to take control of the smallsat industry. Then again, there are a lot of smallsat customers and only so many launches. I think there's going to be plenty of business to go around. And as I have mentioned a number of times, Virgin Orbit is not going to be restricted to, well, orbit. Instead, once they add a third stage onto their Launcher 1 rocket, they are going to be capable of sending small sats to other planets. And very soon, within the next 1 to 2 years, they plan to send a probe to Mars with a consortium of Polish scientific organizations and universities already having signed a contract. It is going to be a race, strangely enough, between a New Zealand company, Rocket Lab, and a British company, Virgin Orbit, as to who gets the first commercial satellite to another planet. And yes, they're both technically American companies, and I don't give a damn. But if you want to talk about a 100% UK rocket, it's Orbex, who I mentioned before. This is a tiny rocket. It's also called Orbex Prime. Its first stage is completely reusable and recoverable, although all of the methods involved have not quite been described yet. It's comprised of carbon fiber and 3D printed engines. Extremely inexpensive way of getting small sats into orbit, and it is launched from northern Scotland. And why are all these rockets being launched from such northerly locations? Isn't the equator supposed to be better? Not when you're talking about polar orbits, and that is ideal for certain kinds of satellites. Specifically, satellites that require polar orbits. The satellites orbit as the Earth rotates underneath them, giving the satellite a complete and comprehensive view of the planet. This makes it extremely useful for observational satellites, weather satellites, those sorts of things. And if we're talking about small sats that have to make use of that sort of technology, well, launching from a location like northern Scotland is absolutely perfect. And you can see the description of what I've been talking about here in this particular video. This is indeed the perfect location to be launching these sorts of satellites from, bringing a huge amount of space business and space dollars, or pounds I suppose, to northern Scotland. No one would have ever anticipated this, and Orbex is not the only company taking advantage of it. So too is a company called Skylon. Now, I've talked about these guys a number of times in the past, but there are a few things that will make them advantageous. First of all, their XL rocket is expected to be able to carry the same amount of payload to a sun-synchronous orbit as the Virgin Orbit rocket will be able to. On top of that, it runs off of a very eco-friendly fuel called EcoScene, which is non-recyclable plastic, and then finally it's Space Tug that will allow it to clean up space junk, allowing Skyrora to earn additional revenues cleaning up low Earth orbit after its primary mission. These guys are going to be very competitive as well. But there are a couple of other factors that are going to make Britain way more than just the king of the small sats. And yes, I think you're starting to get the idea. Rolls-Royce, as I mentioned in a video that I have linked in the description, is coming out with a nuclear space propulsion system. Probably nuclear thermal, but it might be nuclear electric, and they're basing it on micro-nuclear reactors designed for small communities. Something that they intend to use all over the world for practical purposes on Earth, and these very same reactors could be used to power engines in space. And it is Great Britain that has decided to take the lead on this and is currently in a race with the United States to come out with the first practical form of nuclear propulsion. But what kind of ship might they use it on? Let me introduce you to a British-designed spaceplane that is going to change everything for the future of British spaceflight and allow them to go toe-to-toe with everybody, including SpaceX. It's called the Skylon, and it runs off of an engine called the Sabre, a hybrid hypersonic jet engine and rocket engine. What this does is it travels at Mach 5.5 at an altitude of just over 20 kilometers. Once it reaches this speed and this altitude, the conventional rocket engines cut in, burning both liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, propelling it into orbit at Mach 25. It is capable of carrying 15 metric tons into orbit, or more importantly, up to 30 passengers in a special passenger module. And also it has a second stage that it can carry that can allow interstellar probes, that sort of thing, to travel even further. And if the Starship can be refueled in orbit, why not this thing? This has an amazing potential capability of completely transforming mankind's access to not only low Earth orbit, but the moon and other places in the solar system. And it's in development now. The jet engines designed to propel it to Mach 5.5 have been successfully tested, and it has millions of pounds currently invested. The British government is behind this concept, and there's every reason to believe that they're going to be successful. Look out, Starship. The British are coming. The British are coming. And yes, this thing could be used to manufacture larger vessels in orbit, vessels designed for interplanetary use, utilizing Rolls-Royce nuclear engines, for example, space stations, all sorts of applications. And of course, since it's a space plane, it does not require additional stages in order to get it into orbit, and it is fully reusable, capable of landing on any significant runway. This is how the space shuttle should have been, and it's currently in development right now, not by NASA, but by Britain. And this is why I think the British are a force to be reckoned with in the future of spaceflight. Now look, guys, I have not become such an Anglophile that I have lost sight of reality, okay? I know that the vast majority of space flight, space science, and all of space development is still going to be largely taking place in the United States. My channel is going to remain focused on what's going on here with SpaceX, obviously, with ULA, with the SLS, begrudgingly, but I mean, they're going to the moon here fairly soon. Artemis, all of these things. I am going to remain very focused on that regardless of where I happen to live. That having been said, There is so much happening in Great Britain right now, as I hope I've been able to convey to you, that it needs to be covered. Somebody needs to be there covering it. Now, there are some folks who are doing just that, but I would like to be one of them. I don't think there's enough YouTube channels who are covering what is happening in Great Britain in person, on site. I want to go to all three of these spaceports. I want to see what's developing with Rolls-Royce and their nuclear propulsion initiatives. I want to see what's happening with space planes that can deliver more than 20 metric tons to low Earth orbit utilizing a hybrid jet and rocket engine. What an amazing concept. That's simply astonishing, all the way to what Virgin Orbit is doing and their innovative solutions that really threaten to dominate the entire small sat industry. And given this is where satellites are heading as far as technology is concerned, they're in a position to grab a huge amount of the satellite market, period. This is an amazingly strong position to be in, and frankly, I think the world is kind of missing the point on this. All of the focus is on SpaceX and Starship, and so it should be. The idea of going to Mars, colonizing Mars, all of these things, of course, should be the most exciting thing to the human race, but that doesn't mean we should ignore everything else that's going on, and there is a lot going on, not just with Virgin Orbit, not just with Rolls-Royce and nuclear thermal propulsion, but with all kinds of British companies with all sorts of new types of innovation from a country that nobody would have imagined would be accomplishing anything like this when I was a young man. Nobody had the slightest notion that the British government or the British people would be able to accomplish anything like this except on science fiction shows. And guess what? They're accomplishing it for real, and they're accomplishing it big time, and I applaud them for that. If you like the way I talk about things, if you like the fact that I address issues that maybe other channels don't necessarily do on such a regular basis, you know how to support me. It's all in the description. As you may have seen recently, my Patreon supporters had an opportunity to carry out a private conversation with me on Discord. You can become a Discord member for $3 a month. It's a pretty inexpensive thing to do, and I'm going to be bringing more benefits to those who support me on a regular basis. So until Great Britain achieves their objective of seizing at least 10% of the world space economy, and as that grows, that's going to be an awful lot of money and is going to make a huge difference to the people of Britain and to their well-being. Until all of this comes to fruition, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.